How are you? How are you? What's up? Good vibes. So, straight out of Africa, I am Y311H, and it's a pleasure, my friend, to be joined by you today. Lots of respect and love to yourself, wonderful creature. Let me tell you what it is that we shall be doing today, which, my friend, is reacting. Yes, reacting to videos together with the intentions of spreading love to the whole world, unconditional love, peace, honesty, and forgiveness to the whole world, my friend. And together we can make that happen. So, good vibes. So, I would request you that have clicked for the first time to hit that subscribe button, that like button, and join us on our mission of spreading love. Now, because of that, my friend, I have something here that I would like to share with you. No, not the fruits of today. Something else. It's like fruits still, but fruits for the soul. And it comes from some good vibes book here, The Guide of Life. This is what it says. I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I am saved from my enemies. Wonderful word from Psalm 18:1 going down. Surely, my friends, God is great, merciful, and extremely loving. My friend, for that reason alone, we would give thanks, and we are going to give thanks to our Creator before we dive in. Dear Lord Father, we thank you, dear Lord, for this day. We thank you for your goodness in our lives, Father, for your love, dear Lord, for everything that you've done in each and everyone's life, Father. All glory and honor belong unto you, Father. Dear Lord, there is this soul that have joined us today, Father. You are wonderfully created soul, Father. Dear Lord, please help us to spread love together with them to the whole world. Help us, dear Lord, to speak of this message that we have here, and may it reach everyone in all corners of the world. Guide us through reacting to these videos, Father, and fill us with your spirit. Remember this soul, Father, that we are with individually, and intervene in their lives. In Jesus' mighty name, we do pray, trusting and believing. Amen. Good vibes, soul. Let's dive in. Much love.
You guys are not going to believe your eyes. I had to pull over to show you. Look. Do you see all the fireflies?
Have y'all heard about the feral people that live in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains? Legend has it that there are groups of feral humans living deep in the mountains of Appalachia, and apparently they are cannibals? One of the most known possible instances of the wild man is the devastatingly sad story of 6-year-old Dennis Martin. Dennis Martin was just a few days shy of his 7th birthday when he went on a camping trip for Father's Day weekend in the summer of 1969. Dennis, his 9-year-old brother, their father, and their grandfather all went on a multi-day hike from Cades Cove to the Appalachian Trail. After spending the night at the Russell Field Shelter, they hiked Saturday to the grassy area of Spence Field, which is on the Tennessee and North Carolina line. And this is a picture of Spence Ridge where they would have set up camp. While here, the Martin family had ran into an unrelated Martin family from Alabama, who also had 2 young boys with them. So all the parents sat together while they watched the children play. At around 4:30 p.m., the boys were huddled up planning a prank to sneak around behind the adults and jump out and scare them. The parents could tell what the children were up to, but they just played along. The boys' plan was to split up and jump out of both sides of the woods to scare the parents. Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt that was easy to see, so the older 3 boys sent him in the opposite direction by himself. The older boys jumped out, booed the family, and everyone had fun, but when it was time for Dennis to jump out, he didn't. Now, it had only been a few minutes since his dad had saw Dennis sneaking away, but he didn't waste any time before calling out for his son. His dad walked back and forth several miles in every direction, going down nearby trails, and he never found Dennis. Dennis's grandfather hiked the 6 miles from Spence Field all the way back to Cades Cove to report to rangers. He notified the rangers at 8:30 p.m. on Saturday and then hiked several miles back to Spence Field and looked for Dennis the entire way, never finding anything. As darkness started to fall on Saturday, so did about 2.5 inches of rain. The family and rangers searched as much as they could through the night. They asked everybody they seen and passed on the trail if they had seen or heard anything about Dennis, and nobody had. Dennis was nowhere to be found. On Sunday, a heavy search for Dennis Martin began at 5 a.m. 400 volunteers helped search for Dennis, covering 60 square miles. To this day, it's still the largest search operation in the Great Smoky Mountains National Forest history. Unfortunately, he was never found. There were heavy rains that washed away any traces that might have been left. We did find one set of footprints though. One foot had an Oxford shoe, which is the shoe that Dennis was wearing when he went missing, and the other was barefoot, but the parents were convinced that the footprints were too large to be Dennis's. A month later, a man came forward and said that he had been in Cades Cove and he was trying to photograph a bear, and he claimed he heard a piercing scream which sounded like a child. When he went to see what the sound was, all he saw was an old feral-looking man who darted off into the woods. Where he was standing, he found a piece of paper that had a hand-drawn map on it, which makes many people theorize that Dennis's disappearance was at the hands of this group of wild men, the feral, allegedly cannibalistic people who were rumored to live in the Appalachian Mountains. But this report was a month after his disappearance. Dennis was sadly never found, and it's unlikely that we will ever know what actually happened to him.
This is a breaking story right now. This is a catastrophic crash test failure of Thri-Beam guardrail. Our EVs simply cannot be contained by our current barriers.
Electric vehicles typically weigh 20 to 50% more than gas-powered vehicles, and this is mainly due to the weight of the battery. These vehicles also have much lower centers of gravity. Because of these differences, guardrails can only do so much to stop these vehicles from pushing through barriers. In one study, engineers from Nebraska actually tested a Rivian crashing into a guardrail. The nearly 4-ton Rivian vehicle plowed through the guardrail. It did not hold it back at all. This is a huge problem because guardrails are an older technology that are all across the United States, and we depend on these guardrails to keep people safe.
Anyone else thought about the idea that we were all groomed from a very young age to be members of a cult? And by cult, I mean the idea of trading 40 to 50 years of your life for maybe 10 or 15 years of freedom once you're too old to actually enjoy it. And if you question this cult, if you question this traditional model that we were all tricked into believing was the only way to do things, you're considered crazy, or you're considered someone that doesn't really want to work, or someone that's lazy. And in reality, you're just trying to think critically and ask yourself, is this really the best way to do things? Is it really the best way to do things to spend 8 to 10 waking hours a day away from the people you love most, 5 days a week, and in return, you get 2 days. You get 2 days. And on those 2 days, you got to do all the things that you couldn't do during the previous 5 days because, again, you were busy working. Like, how is everyone okay with this trade-off? You trade 5 days for 2. You trade 40 to 50 years for 10 to 15, if you're talking about the average life expectancy in the United States. How's that a fair trade? And despite this, everyone goes along with it. Everyone signs up for that college tuition. Everyone signs up for them student loans. Why? I don't know. They probably don't even know why themselves. Because it's the only way to do things? It's not the only way to do things. It's just the accepted way to do things. It's just the way to do things when you fall in line and don't question the norm.
If you have a gas stove and when you turn it on, all you hear is the clicking and it never ignites, maybe you're using a lighter to ignite it because you can't get the igniter to work. Well, it's a really simple fix. All we have to do, if this is not too hot, we'll have to pull it apart, and what we're looking for is a little hole here. These holes need to be cleaned out with something. So you want to use something, just a little tiny little piece of a clip or something, and make sure these holes are clear. And you can even give them a little bit of blow. Make sure all that dirt and debris is out of there. This is going to help the gas to flow through into this chamber so that the spark can actually ignite it. You can see now it'll basically instantly light. It's a super easy to fix to do, and if you didn't know that, You might not also know that these gas stoves produce CO2, and you're always supposed to have ventilation. This is a monitor that can tell us that we're in an unhealthy air climate right now. You can pick these up on the link in my bio. Having healthy air to breathe is super important. It can improve brain function. Be sure to check them out, and if you like this tip, be sure to hit the thumbs up.
A lot of people, for some reason, think that if they live in Tennessee, especially like middle Tennessee and over, they are safe from the creepy Appalachia stuff. But you're not. You are not, and this story proves it. So let's get into it. And this story also gives a really good lesson of don't taunt the things in the woods because they don't play nice. The story occurred when this follower was around 8 to 9 years old. They were out in a field minding their own business with their cousin when they started to hear some sort of stomping sound coming from the tree line. They decide for some reason to just turn around and yell at it to stop. They didn't know what it was, but they were yelling at something, and their dad immediately stopped that. And you would think that would be the end of the story, but they got this thing's attention. Later on, they are actually in the woods this time, and they hear the stomping again. So what do? They start yelling again. They start yelling at this sound, still not knowing what they're yelling at, and now they're throwing insults, calling it names and everything under the sun. The louder they were yelling, the louder the stomping was getting until this thing was fully sprinting at them, so they take off running. They look behind them to see something very tall and very thin, wearing what seems to be some sort of white gown, charging at them full speed. Now, it doesn't chase them all the way, it eventually stops, but they keep running home. They get home and they share their story with their family members, and no one believes them until other people start seeing it too. They never crossed that fence line again, and luckily that thing stayed behind the fence, but it watched them for years and years. So, don't taunt the things in the woods.
Almost all nations are brought together by myths. We are brought together by lies. For example, it might be that Britain single-handedly saved the world from the Nazis, or that the Pilgrim Fathers of America were faultless saints, or that China's always been a homogeneous happy family. Then you have nationalist legends like Napoleon, Bolivar, Mandela, Gandhi and Nobunaga. All peoples have their romanticised tales of heroes to tell. It makes them different from the people a few miles over. This is what Plato discusses in his idea of the noble lie. The noble lie is a myth or a story that we tell to unite people under one banner. In his Republic, Plato asks how it is that we can bond people together and care for strangers hundreds of miles away. He asks how can we be more inclined to the state and each other than ourselves? What must rulers and governments do? For Plato, we need one single grand lie which must be believed by everybody, including the rulers, ideally, but failing that, the rest of the city. This lie must fulfill two functions. Firstly, it must create a civic or national identity where we all feel we belong. It says this is our territory and this is our home. Secondly, it must reinforce a particular structure for that society which has certain values. In Plato's Greece, this meant a three-class structure of gold, silver and bronze citizens. But today, it might be capitalism, liberalism, legalism, communism, piety and so on. So what are your nation's stories? What are the myths and stories you tell to reinforce certain values and solidarity?
So there's a few iconic things in the Kimberley. This is one of them. This is a boab. Now, there's a few arguments how these actually got into Australia, but they're pretty much exactly the same as one of the species in Madagascar. So the general theory is that one of the seed pods had actually travelled across the ocean from Madagascar to Australia many thousands of years ago. So something like this here would be about 1,500 years old. When the trees are quite young, the centre of the tree will hold a lot of water. When the tree reaches a certain age, the centre of the tree will hollow out. These are one of the funkiest plants on the planet.
What you doing, Bo? Have you heard of the Valley of Headless Men? So there's this place in one of the most remote wildernesses anywhere in the world, and despite being a national park since the 1970s, it still has unexplored areas to this day. Which is understandable as it's only accessible by air, has these deep river canyons and huge mountains, and has this complex cave system. But the mysterious thing about this place is that back in 1908, these two brothers, the MacLeod brothers, came searching for gold but disappeared, only to be found a year later with their heads removed. Then just 9 years later, this Swiss gold miner, Martin Martin Jorgensen was also found missing his head. And later in 1945, another man was found still in his sleeping bag missing his head. And what makes this story so interesting is just a year before all these incidences, there used to be this very renowned tribe that lived in the area called the Naha tribe, and they all just suddenly disappeared completely from the area. And to make it even more strange, all the other indigenous tribes in the area say that they've all specifically avoided this valley for centuries because of some unknown evil that they say haunts it. And there's all kinds of theories for why this happened, from there being feral people in the cave systems that attack you, to the entrance of some ancient world being there and having a tropical climate due to hot springs which do exist in the area, to the Naha tribe not disappearing at all but wanting to keep the gold for themselves and going deeper into the wilderness. Regardless, this place is still extremely mysterious to this day.
Cut your risk of dementia by 20% with one simple change. A study found eating just 1 ounce of processed red meat daily, like bacon, sausage, hot dog, that type of thing, increased dementia risk by 14%. However, replacing processed red meats with nuts and legumes decreased the risk of dementia by 20%. Processed meats are usually high in sodium and saturated fats and various other things that can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. Nuts and legumes, on the other hand, are packed with healthy, unsaturated fats and dietary fibers that lower your risk of heart disease. In recent years, it's become clear that your cardiovascular health is a strong predictor of risk for dementia later in life. You do not have to totally eliminate processed meats to see a benefit. Even making occasional substitutions can be beneficial for your cardiovascular and cognitive health.
Absolutely nothing could have prepared me for the sound this bird makes. So listen closely, my friends. Oh.
It's not a UFO, but you can see this. NASA has deployed a sailboat in space, 600 miles above Earth. Except instead of wind, it's steering and being pushed through space by the sun's light. Basically, NASA sent this tiny box to space. This is less than 13 inches per side. And when it was up there, it deployed these giant reflective wings. Each side is 30 feet. Light from the sun travels through space and hits this solar sail and is reflected off of it. But some of this energy is transferred and it propels the spacecraft. Just a tiny bit, but that light is constant. And they adjust this angle of the spacecraft to steer just like a sailboat. So in theory, you wouldn't need to bring a bunch of fuel for a spacecraft in space for it to travel really far because the fuel is already in space. It's the sun. And because it's so large and so reflective, you can actually see it from Earth. It'll look like a bright star, and I haven't tried it, but apparently you can find it with the NASA app. The goal of the mission is to test the technology so that it can be perfected enough so that one day it can be used to bring spacecraft to the moon or Mars or even further.
Easily one of the weirdest details that a lot of people don't realize about medieval culture and food is just how much our food has actually grown. And I don't mean that in terms of spices or flavorings, though that much is obvious when we talk about it. I mean just raw size. This, right here, is basically a medieval chicken. Notice how small this is. If I was going to go to a Kroger or Walmart or anything like that, and I was going to go and get a rotisserie chicken, it is going to be 3, 4, 5 times this size, easily. This is one of the key reasons as to why meat was so expensive, because animals themselves were much smaller. We think of like European war horses as being these big, giant, grandiose things, but they were much smaller typically than a lot of the horses that people have now. This is the same thing that applies to cows, to pigs, to chickens, to everything. They were on average much smaller. It is only thanks to modern breeding techniques, along with, modern food supplies, that we're able to have animals that are as large as they are.
In the early 1900s, chips were packed into paper bags, where they stayed fresh for only a day. In the 1970s, a revolutionary process called co-extrusion allowed manufacturers to layer several types of plastic into a single film. Today, some of these multi-layer packages, or MLPs, can have as many as 11 layers. The middle of a modern chip bag is usually made from plastic resistant to oil, grease, and moisture. But this doesn't fully block oxygen or light, so it's often coated with aluminum to form the innermost layer. The bag's outer layers must be strong, flexible, and printable, so they're made with two plastics. The undercoat has the graphics, the outermost layer protects them. Before a bag is sealed, it's filled with nitrogen gas to create a low-oxygen, low-moisture atmosphere. Together, this design helps chips stay fresh and crisp for 6 months.
Did you know that most people prefer delusion to the truth? This is the famous story of Alvin Ford. Alvin looks like he had a pretty normal childhood. He played sports, he was captain of some of the sports teams, he had leadership positions at his school. But by the time he got into his early 20s, he was showing signs of schizophrenia. He shoots a wounded police officer execution style during an armed robbery, and he is captured, he's sent to prison, he eventually gets to death row. Now, while he's on death row, he is all into his schizophrenic delusions. He believes that he's the Pope and he can pardon himself. He believes that he can control the mind of the governor. Even though he's on death row, he believes that he cannot be killed. So it brought up the legal question, is it unusual crime and punishment to execute someone who is fully in their delusional state and doesn't think that this is a punishment at all? Just to finish that side of the story, it ends up going to the Supreme Court. They decide it is cruel and unusual punishment. He kind of remains in legal limbo, and he dies of natural causes in 1991. What I want to talk about is there's a psychology professor who every year with his students gives his student a poll. And the question is this: if you were Alvin and you are fully into your schizophrenic delusion that you are special, that you have power over people, all of that, would you want the medication that you need to leave those delusions? But upon doing so, you come to the realization that you have murdered people and you are going to die because you're on death row. Or if you decide not to get the mental health help that you need, you still end up going to death row, but you die in your delusion that none of this is happening and it's all going to be okay because you're special and you can control people, and that's how you die. So according to the data by Dr. David Landers, this psychologist, 3/4 of the people surveyed would rather die in their delusion than take whatever medication that they could take to leave the illusion but face the truth. And that is fascinating. So it is actual evidence that most people prefer to take the blue pill. And this really puzzled him because this guy is one of the ones who he didn't even think about it. He wanted to know the truth, and he would die with whatever the truth was. And that's something that we find with people who end up in nihilism or existential crisis or the void. For whatever reason, these people seem to have core values of truth-seeking that allows them to want to know the truth even if it means you suffer more, even if it's a harsh truth, even if it's a truth that makes you sad. There's a certain subset there that pushes into that where other people have different core values, and so they don't go down those rabbit holes. To read more on that, I recommend the book Optimistic Nihilism. I'm reading it again right now, and I'm really enjoying it.
Why do we have double letters in English? Well, this actually has been a spelling convention that's been around for a long time. And it's all about preserving the short vowel. So rabbit has to have two B's so it doesn't say rabbit. Same with cotton. You have to have two T's or it says coton. And in apple, you have to have two P's or it says apple. This was created to help the reader know without a doubt that vowel is short. It gets a little trickier when we have to add suffixes. Again, it's all about preserving the short vowel sound. Hop has a short vowel, but here's the thing. The suffix has to begin with a vowel to employ the doubling rule. If we add ed, we have to double so it says hopped. If we don't, that one consonant says hoped. With swim, it has a short vowel, followed by a vowel suffix. So we double so it says swimming. If not, it would say swiming. When we teach suffixes, it's all about the first letter. And if the first letter in the suffix is a vowel, we have to double if the base word has a short vowel in it. Win becomes winnable, skip, skipped, bit, bitten, run, runner, sad, saddest, hug, hugging, slug, sluggish, fun, funny. The doubling tells our eyes that first vowel is short.
Do it for the camera. Action. Oh my God.
That is whale earwax. Whales used to be land mammals, and as a result, they used to have ears. That is their ear hole. Over time, they developed into full-time sea animals and didn't really need their ears anymore. But they retained one key feature from having ears: earwax. And turns out that whales accumulate a lot of earwax, like a lot. For example, blue whales' earwax plugs can grow up to 10 inches in length. And every so often, their earwax gets pushed out of their body like a tube of toothpaste, looking like this. This is taking Shrek's ear candle a run for its money. Then scientists at Baylor University started studying whale earwax and were shocked to find that there was an earful of information. So like tree rings, whale earwax accumulates in layers, with each layer representing 6 to 12 months of a whale's life. This has been known for decades and has been used to determine whale age. But then they realized that whale earwax provided a lot more information than just age. Each layer was a chronological biochemical fingerprint of what was coursing through that whale's body that particular year. And what immediately jumped out to these scientists was the stress hormone cortisol. Here's where it gets really interesting. Baylor scientist Trumbull Yusenko began measuring cortisol levels in whales as old as 153 years old and compared that to whaling data from the 20th century. Now take a look at this. The black line is the whale's stress levels, and the blue line is whaling activity. See this massive jump in the 1960s? This was when whaling was at its peak, and look where those cortisol levels are. The cortisol levels are also at its peak. In fact, this is the highest whale's cortisol measured in the 20th century. When more whales are caught, whale stress goes up. There is one discrepancy right here during World War II, where whaling decreased, but cortisol levels still rose by 10%. But remember, even though the oceans were free from whaling harpoons, it was replaced with U-boats, subs, and battleships. Disturbance is sure to cause stress among whales. The more you know. Science is very cool. And very weird.
During World War II, the U.S. War Department figured out a way to send mail without using a single sheet of paper, and it looked something like this. The service was called Vmail, V for victory, and it was used by the War and Navy departments of the U.S. military. The way it worked was very simple. You see, inside of this envelope, there's a single piece of paper. But this actually isn't a piece of paper that was written by a soldier. This is actually a photograph. And they started photographing these letters because it was so incredibly expensive to send mail. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army Post Office was processing 2.5 billion pieces of mail every single year. And if you've ever held a ream of 500 sheets of paper in your hand, you have an idea of how expensive it had to be to transport all of that mail overseas from either Europe or Asia back to the United States. So the War Department came up with the idea of Vmail, where they would simply give out this form to soldiers who would then fill the entire thing out, including the letter that they were going to send, and after it had been read by the censors, it was photographed, and then that film was transported back to the United States. And once back in the United States, that entire roll of film would be exposed on photographic paper, just like this one right here, and then each one of these individual letters would be cut out, slipped into this individual envelope that was designed for this mail, and then sent on to its eventual recipient. Over 1 billion pieces of mail were transported this way by the end of the war at incredible savings in both fuel and time. And this new paperless production of letters was an incredible leap forward in an innovative way to send mail.
If you want to prevent blood sugar spike during your heavy carbohydrate meal, you need to add fiber to your meal. And you need to take that fiber at the beginning of your meal. When you do this, the fiber will slow down the absorption of carbohydrates from the food you eat. And therefore, there's no blood sugar spike and no insulin spike. And when there's no insulin spike, there's no blood sugar crash. So you could burn fat easier, your hunger is controlled, you have no cravings, and you have steady energy.
In the event of an emergency prior to a SpaceX launch, how do people escape danger? There's a rapidly deployed chute that leads them from high on the launch pad, safely to the ground, in an experience not unlike being born.